Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 108, Hugh O'Ferrall. Hugh James Vincent O'Ferrall was born in Roscommon, Ireland in 1830. He arrived in Victoria in August 1853 at the age of 21 on the Carntine and stated his occupation as a farmer. He married Mary Brophy in Melbourne on the 7th of May 1859. Mary was only 17 and Hugh 29, and they had 8 children. Mary Brophy was born in Melbourne in 1842. She was the second child of 7, born to John Brophy and Catherine Keneally. John and Catherine were both Irish. John Brophy assisted John Pascoe Faulkner to publish the first newspaper of Melbourne, the Melbourne Advertiser, in 1838. This boy, John Brophy, copied the whole of the little paper in neat handwriting, and his copies were issued to a small public thirsting for news. After 9 issues in this style, Faulkner secured type and with the aid of the boy printed the Advertiser, until extinguished by the Sydney government. Brophy afterwards became a journalist on one of the Melbourne dailies. John Brophy's wife Catherine, Mary Brophy's mother, died at only 39 on the 18th of January 1857 at their residence called Stanley in North Melbourne. John Brophy remarried in 1859 to Eliza Wickham, who was English, and she was previously married to James Reardon and Edward Hutchins, who both died. She married James when she was 28 and Edward only 2 years after their marriage in 1856. Eliza and John had a daughter who was only 18 months old when John died on the 25th of August 1862 at his residence Prospect Villa in Merry Creek. He was only 40 years old. So his wife Eliza then went on to marry George Keane Johnston 3 years after John's death, and they had a son in 1867. However, this marriage does not seem to go smoothly, as on the 22nd of September 1880, an article that George Johnston placed in the paper says, "I will not be responsible for debts contracted to my wife, Eliza Johnston, after this date, George Johnston, Stanley Street, Melbourne." And that quite often happened when the wife left them. So getting back to Hugh O'Ferrall, the first we see of Hugh O'Ferrall in the papers is on the 27th of January 1862, and it says, "Collector of Imposts. The Governor, with the advice of the Executive Council, has been pleased to appoint Hugh James Vincent O'Ferrall, licensing clerk, to be a collector of imposts in Melbourne at the Lands and Survey Office." So a very different occupation to what he did in Ireland. In 1864, a company was introduced, the Union Jack Reef Company. The place of operation is near Matlock in the mining district of Beechworth, and one of the shareholders is listed as Hugh James Vincent O'Ferrall. 2 years later, in the Ophir Gold Mining Company, the place of operations is at European Reef in Inglewood, and the previous shares that he held in the Beechworth were only 8. In this one, he put 500 shares in. In the same year, he also put shares in the Leicester Gold Mining Company at Leicester Reef in Inglewood. This time, Hugh James Vincent O'Ferrall of Castlemaine, 834 shares. And in the Jason Gold Mining Company, again in the same year, at Bath Reef, Inglewood, Hugh James Vincent O'Ferrall from Melbourne, 1,000 shares. So he seems to be heavily investing in gold companies, and it indicates that he's doing quite well. 7 years later, in October 1873, by what commenced as a routine examination of accounts by the Audit Office, it was discovered that Hugh O'Ferrall, who was a land licensing agent and officer of the Department of Crown Lands and Survey, had defrauded his department during a prolonged period of inadequate financial supervision dating back as far as 1866. And interestingly, those 3 heavy shares going into those gold companies were in 1866. And this committed in the process of what proved to be the largest embezzlement by a Victorian public servant to occur in the 19th century. This one had remained undetected due to a lack of adequate process and procedures implemented to detect corruption. Licenses were given to people who officials favoured or accepted bribes. Together with minutes and transcripts of evidence, it was tabled in the Legislative Assembly of Victoria. And it is noteworthy that the Select Committee did not pursue the question of possible collusion between O'Ferrall and certain staff members working for the Audit Office. So a bit of background. During this Selection Act era of the 1860s, the Lands Department were responsible for supervising the sale of millions of acres of Crown land and collecting payments and licensing fees from tens of thousands of purchasers. This enormous task almost overwhelmed the limited resources of the department, leading to the Audit Office's well-founded fears for the integrity of government revenue. Before the Selection Acts, almost all the pastoral and agricultural land in Victoria was in the hands of squatters, who held the land under various forms of pastoral licences since the first white settlement. The aim of the Selection Acts was to unlock the land, throwing open the squatters' enormous runs by selection for aspiring small farmers and enabling them to pay their land off over time. In the 1860s, there were 4 versions of the Successive Land Act, and it attempted to find a method to ensure that the land was purchased by genuine farmers rather than dummies acting on behalf of squatters. The first 2 Land Acts were disastrous failures in this regard, with most land sold passing directly or indirectly to the squatters. The Third Act tended to increase the price the squatters paid, but still failed to settle many small farmers on the land. By 1869, virtually the entire Western District had been bought up by squatters. However, large areas of land in the Wimmera, Gippsland and Central Victoria were still available for selection, and the 1869 Act finally established a sound system of selection and land sales, leading to a dramatic increase in the number of small farmers in these areas and a consequent increase in the work of the Lands Department. The Selection Acts led to widespread corruption in rural Victoria, as dummies, land sharks and unscrupulous agents successfully lined their pockets while delivering millions of acres of land to squatters. Inevitably, the corruption spread through the Lands Department itself, which was responsible for supervising the working of the Acts. During the 1860s, several regional officers of the department were dismissed for allowing blatant evasion of the Land Acts, and many others retired from their lowly paid positions as wealthy men. And in an episode 3 on Alfred Grintle, it's highly suspected this is what forced Alfred Grintle from his land, as even though it was owned in his name, it seemed that he was a dummy buyer and he wasn't going to buy into that. As it's covered in that episode, he disappeared without a trace, and murder was one of the possible theories. As both the land sales and the collection of payments were the responsibilities of the Lands Department, the department handled vast sums of money during this period, collecting well over £500,000 each year. The Audit Commissioners were aware of this and pointed out possible dangers, noting in 1866 to the Crown that in this colony it's rapidly becoming one of the largest landlords in the world, and the greatest care in collecting the rents will be requisite. In October 1873, when the inspection of O'Ferrall's accounts was due, the Audit Commissioners received information that he'd returned a cheque he had received for a licence because it was crossed. This naturally aroused suspicion, and Francis Jones, the inspecting commissioner, decided to go behind all the vouchers and accounts, construct a register of Crown licensees, and work back from that to conduct a full audit of O'Ferrall's accounts. On the 14th and 15th of October 1873, Commissioner Jones and O'Ferrall worked together on accounts and found no errors. Jones then told O'Ferrall that the following day he would begin to construct a register. However, the next morning, O'Ferrall did not come to work, sending this letter to his superior. C.H. Fletcher. Dear Fletcher, I have been throwing up some blood last night and am so weak that I cannot go down to the office today, so you must put off my friend Jones till tomorrow. I remain, my dear Fletcher, yours sincerely, Hugh O'Ferrall. Hugh O'Ferrall disappeared. His wife told Mr. Jones that he'd gone to Colac or possibly Cranbourne, but except for an unconfirmed sighting in New Zealand some months later, there was no trace of O'Ferrall or the missing licence fees. After a delay of several days, caused because O'Ferrall had taken all the keys to his office and the Lands Department would not allow Mr. Jones to force open the door, the inspection continued. A thorough search of O'Ferrall's room found large quantities of unpriced licence forms hidden behind his desk and in the ceiling, as well as various cash books and butts of issued licence forms. These enabled the auditors to piece together the true state of O'Ferrall's accounts, and after several weeks, Commissioner Jones was able to report that O'Ferrall had stolen at least £20,000, an enormous sum in that era when the annual pay of a mid-level public servant would not exceed £400. O'Ferrall was actually paid £300 per year. This was by far the largest embezzlement by a public servant in the 19th century. The basic method by which O'Ferrall committed these frauds was through the use of large quantities of unpriced licence forms, which were supposed to have been destroyed several years earlier. As an example, he would issue a licence to a farmer for £20, but fill in the butt for only £5. The £5 would be remitted to the Treasury, and thus the balance of the butt for that amount when his accounts were audited. The remaining £15 would end up in O'Ferrall's pocket. Naturally, he preferred payments to be in cash or uncrossed cheques. As the Commissioners of Audit emphasised in their reports on the fraud, O'Ferrall's accounts show no discrepancy as tested by the vouchers produced and at various times for inspection. It's only when Mr Jones began to construct a register to show the licence fees that should have been received that the frauds were revealed. It's obvious that a simple fraud like O'Ferrall's could only be carried out in the total absence of supervision. The Audit Office had previously pointed out the dangers of disorganisation in the Lands Department, but nothing had been done to address the problems. In their audits of Hugh O'Ferrall's accounts, the auditors had always relied on Mr Fletcher's certificate that O'Ferrall's collections were accurately accounted for, though, as Fletcher testified, he simply signed whatever O'Ferrall put in front of him. It was only when the Commissioners became suspicious and went behind Fletcher's certificates that the frauds were discovered. However, the Audit Office had neither the resources nor the legal responsibility to do this in any but a tiny minority of cases, so the Commissioners emphasised the need for the departments to have sound systems of internal audit. As Alfred Agg pointed out in the O'Ferrall case, the system failed simply because Mr Fletcher did not do his duty. On the 27th of November 1873, Robert Guterman of the Treasury noted that, amongst the papers gathered in O'Ferrall's office, there was a considerable number of letters from Robert Carter of the Audit Office, which bear evidence that this gentleman was or is under considerable pecuniary obligation to O'Ferrall. One cannot tell what mischief such relation between officials in the relative positions they hold may lead, and it would perhaps be well were you to inquire whether the instances under notice of anything suspicious was attached to them, or whether they lead them to suspect that O'Ferrall's returns may have been tampered with, more particularly so as to there an utter absence of office records which could afford a check on O'Ferrall's returns. Hugh O'Ferrall was known for his ostentatious lifestyle. His wealth did not attract the attention, as it was believed that he had married well and that the properties he owned had been acquired by his wife's money. In spite of this, it is strange that the fact that the clerks in the Audit Office owed him money did not attract the public interest of the inquiry. Only one question was asked on the issue, and the possible implications were never explored. However, after reading the evidence presented to the inquiry, there is a suspicion at least that O'Ferrall's success in avoiding detection for many years was due, at least in part, to collusion in the Audit Office. The inquiry placed the blame for the frauds unequivocally with the Lands Department and in particular Mr Fletcher. The only criticism of the Commissioners was that they did not make stronger representations to the Minister for Lands in time to prevent O'Ferrall's escape. Following the O'Ferrall case, Clement Hodgkinson, the Assistant Commissioner of Crown Lands, resigned from public service, and C.H. Fletcher, O'Ferrall's immediate superior, was demoted to the bottom of his grade with a large reduction in his salary. The case led to a complete reform in the methods of revenue collection in the Lands Department. On the 11th of November 1873, in the Victoria Police Gazette, Hugh J. Vincent O'Ferrall is charged on warrant with embezzling upwards of £9,000, the moneys of the Victorian government, since October 1870. Offender is a native of Dublin and speaks with an accent of that city, 35 to 40 years of age, 6 feet 1 or 2 inches high, dark complexion, hair, whiskers, beard and moustache, wears his hair long and thick behind, small features, stooping shoulders, slovenly gait, amiable manners, slight mixture of Hindu blood in his veins, dresses carelessly in tweed suit and low-crowned dark hat, fond of dogs and sports. He was employed as a clerk in the Crown Lands Department. And on the 2nd of April 1875, Hugh J. Vincent O'Ferrall, charged with embezzling the monies of the Victorian government, was arrested at Singapore in December 1874 and is now in Melbourne jail awaiting his trial. So where had O'Ferrall been while he was on the run? Well, in the Weekly Times in Melbourne, on the 16th of January 1875, it does outline where he had been. It says, O'Ferrall is run to earth at last, and it must really be a relief to him to know that the almost inevitable has come at last, finishing off all doubts and fears. In a hurry he went to New Zealand. However, New Zealand became too hot, and he sought the quieter society of New Caledonia, where he had cousins and friends, and where he believed no extradition could give him up to his pursuers. He discovered a silver mine and tried to work it there, but the fates were against him. He lived nearly for 3 months in the wildest bush, not once during that time seeing a white face. He was prostrated by disease, and his body was covered in loathsome sores. He lingered in a lonely mia, and a blackfellow brought him his meals. Recovering and believing the pursuit had been abandoned, he again entered society of white men, only to learn that the detectives were on his trail, still waiting and watching. Hotly pursued, he rushed to the seacoast and took a boat in the Pacific Ocean for 24 hours, regardless of the remorseful tropical sun and the heavy night dews. He rowed miles across the sea to an uninhabited island, and arrangements were made by which a steamer was to call in and take him off. However, the steamer changes course. He then sets grass on fire, and the whole island is soon ablaze, and his friends rescue him. He then resorts to chartering a ketch for Brisbane, landing at Brisbane, where he lurked in the shady sides of streets and in dark alleys, and he waited on a mail steamer. And it was just in time, for the town had already got too hot to hold him. He made his way on board the steamer and did not breathe freely until he saw Townsville and the Great Barrier Reef. And it said that the persistent nemesis is still a dog at his heels. Another article was asking where Detective Mackay was, the fact that he'd been to New Caledonia and presumably had tracked O'Ferrall down. However, he hasn't returned with him. And it says O'Ferrall is alleged to have been in New Caledonia when the detective left. He had a fortnight allowed him to abscond from the scene. Is he now to be allowed a month to take his departure from a colony where, if the police were vigilant or the authorities here disposed to act, surely he would have been arrested weeks ago? And in May 1874, O'Ferrall, it seems, is still in New Caledonia and, according to the latest accounts, is doing well. He's a part proprietor of a mine, and with funds flushed from the people of Victoria, is no doubt in a fair way to become a successful speculator and a rich man. Do they intend to allow O'Ferrall to remain there in the full enjoyment of a glorious climate, freedom, and plenty of cash? Is this the monument of success that can be commanded by a swindling civil servant in Victoria? If so, they must indeed be weaker than we take them to be. It has for a long time been more than whispered that, for very grave reasons, there were many persons connected with the Lands Department who do not desire that the culprit should be brought to justice, and the measures taken up to the present, avowedly for the purpose of securing his arrest, seem to indicate that the anxiety to have O'Ferrall in the colony again is far from being as great as had been supposed. In the first place, O'Ferrall was allowed to leave the colony. Had he been a bank defaulter, this even would have been difficult for him to do so. Then a junior member of the detective force was sent on a wild goose chase to Fiji after him. That, of course, was fruitless. And finally, the same detective has been dispatched to New Caledonia, the dependencies of a foreign power, and after learning that without doubt the embezzler was there, comes away without his prisoner. If there really is a determination on the part of the government to have O'Ferrall before a court of justice, Why is it that senior and experienced detectives are not sent after him? Surely if O'Ferrall is in New Caledonia, there is no reason why these men could not obtain custody of him, especially if the French authorities are eager to surrender him. And in January 1875, O'Ferrall, the Lands Office defaulter, is a passenger in custody by the legislator Torres Straits mail ship to Brisbane. They will arrive in Melbourne tonight or tomorrow morning by the Sydney steamer. He came on to Australia from Singapore by the steamship Somerset. Those who are intimately acquainted with O'Ferrall say it is extremely probable that he will make some attempt on his life to avoid the shame and disgrace of a public exhibition in a criminal court. It will be the fault, however, of the officer in charge of him if any facilities be afforded to him to commit an act of this character. So in the Melbourne Age on the 11th of February 1875, the article titled The Defaulter O'Ferrall. Hugh James Vincent O'Ferrall was charged at the City Police Court yesterday with having embezzled 3 sums of money from the Lands Department in which he was employed as a clerk. The sums in question were £24, £150 and £22, 7 shillings and 6 pence, but this by no means furnished an adequate total of the sum of his defalcations. Mr. Gurner, the Crown's solicitor, opened up with a short history of the prisoner's connection with the Lands Department, stating he'd entered the Lands Department in 1858 as a Crown Lands Ranger and in 1861 was promoted to the Occupation Branch of the department. He stated as far as he ascertained the prisoner had appropriated between £16,000 and £17,000 belonging to the government. It is a curious circumstance that though we have 3 commissioners of audit with salaries of £1,000 a year, not one of the numerous embezzlements from the government during the last 20 years was discovered by them. It really seems rather difficult to see of what use these highly ornamental officials with their staff of clerks are, if they cannot do what very acute managers of large businesses establishments are supposed to be able to do, namely discover frauds very soon after they've been committed by examination of a person's accounts. In the case of O'Ferrall, the Audit Commissioners actually had never taken the trouble to inquire whether any particular number of receipts had been printed in the Lands Office receipt books. Of course, nothing was easier than for a smart rogue to take money, give receipts, and cut out the butts from the books. So as a result, Hugh O'Ferrall was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment with hard labour on the 22nd of April 1875. And in the Mount Alexander Mail, on the 26th of February 1891, the death of the famous O'Ferrall. An unpretentious death notice in the Argus yesterday read as follows: O'Ferrall on the 21st at his residence George Street, East Melbourne. Probably few persons who glanced at the above notice recognised in deceased a prominent civil servant who for many years still cut a considerable dash in Melbourne society with money not his own and afterwards suffered the usual penalty of penal servitude. Hugh O'Ferrall was a 4th-class officer in the Lands Department with a salary of £300 per annum, sufficient for the needs of most men, but not for one of the gay, convivial, sporting nature of O'Ferrall. His private deficiencies, however, easily made up by a free use of public money. In his capacity of receiver of the rent from the factories on the south bank of the Yarra, which were then built on land leased from the department, and also of land licences, O'Ferrall had ample opportunity for absorbing as much cash was needed to keep him going in a fashionable style. At pigeon shooting, coursing and horse racing events, he was always a well-known figure and was a favourite everywhere. Nature had also endowed him with many pleasing and attractive qualities. Tall of nature, large-limbed and of an imposing appearance, he was a noticeable figure in all congregations of men, while his engaging manners and ready Hibernian wit made him many friends. Occasionally, of course, people of an inquiring turn of mind wondered how a 4th-class civil servant with a few hundreds a year could scatter money broadcast in the free and easy manner which was one of O'Ferrall's agreeable peculiarities. But their only half-expressed suspicions were quickly obliterated by the ready explanation that he married a wife with a fortune, and it was her money which enabled him to live at the rate of a couple of thousand a year. To the last, however, he maintained his usual buoyancy of manner and spent his sovereigns freely for the benefit of his followers, and then all at once his friends and the public were astonished by his sudden disappearance. An investigation into his accounts proved that he had embezzled a pretty tune of £19,000. This he had accomplished by a simple process of keeping dummy receipt books. Inquiry also proved that he had been too well trusted by a superior officer, who was said to have been hurried into a premature death by the worry and scandal of the affair. In October 1873, O'Ferrall absconded and for the next 12 months evaded capture. Eventually he was arrested in the Straits Settlement, and on being tried for his offence he received a sentence, but only 4 of these were served, his friends obtaining his liberation on the grounds of his great ill health in prison. Since his release, O'Ferrall has lived a very quiet and retired life in East Melbourne, rarely seen by his former associates. More recently, his health gave way entirely, and his death was not unexpected to the members of his family. He was 55 years of age, although he looked much older. Hugh and Mary had 8 children. The firstborn was John Hugh O'Ferrall, and he was born in East Melbourne in 1860. He died on the 1st of July 1937, aged 77. He did not marry, and in his probate it mentions that he formerly lived in South Caulfield and later at Middle Brighton, that his occupation was a miner, and that the proceeds of his will were to go to Anna O'Ferrall of Black Street, Middle Brighton, which is his younger sister. The second child, Catherine Mary Clorinda O'Ferrall, was born on the 2nd of July 1860. And she died on the 12th of September 1880, aged only 20. And there was a short death notice in the paper, O'Ferrall at Hillsley, Packington Street, Kew, Katie O'Ferrall, aged 20 years, beloved by all who knew her. The third child, Laura Maud O'Ferrall, was born in 1864 in Melbourne. She was an Australian short story writer who mainly wrote using the pseudonym Bushwoman. She was best known for her 1904 book, A Bush Honeymoon and Other Stories. In 1888, she married Tom Palmer Archer and moved with him to a property in outback Queensland, and many of her stories in that book are based on her first-hand experience of rural life. She went on to write short stories for the Australasian paper, which first appeared in November 1894, and the last story in December 1928. Her 1904 book was published in London, and Rolf Boldrewood, another Australian author, who I did an episode on in episode 58, wrote a foreword for her book, and he said, "It appeared to me a matter of simple justice, as well to the British public as to a talented writer, that work of such genuine merit should find a permanent place in literature." In the 1920s, she began writing poems for children that were published regularly in the Australasian, and she also recited those poems on radio. In the 1919 census, they were living in Brighton, Victoria, Laura listed as a journalist and Tom as an agent. They had 5 children, and Laura died on the 10th of June 1929 in Belgrave, Victoria, aged 65. And there was an article where Laura was interviewed, and she went by the hyphenated name of Mrs. Palmer Archer. Bright of eye, artistic in expression, and nimble and picturesque in speech, Mrs. Palmer Archer, in her Melbourne clothes, as seen by the Herald interviewer, scarcely looked like the bushwoman of the Argus. She acknowledged influences of her heredity, for her mother was born while her grandfather was out in Port Phillip Bay reporting for John Pascoe Faulkner's Gazette. Born in Jolimont Square, she was grounded in education at Madame Vlasso's, East Melbourne, helped forward at home, and finished off in a 10-year course at the Academy of Life with her husband at the Warrego and the Flinders in the Queensland Never Never. To her mother, to her godfather, Richard Kerr, one of the pioneers, and to her aunt, Miss Fanny Brophy, Mrs. Archer ascribes the credit of having made her an authoress. Although none of these were writers, they were excellent storytellers, and by them her imagination was fired and stimulated. And the death of Tom Palmer Archer was outlined in 1948. Famous drover dead at 97 at Launceston. Mr. Tom Palmer Archer, who was known throughout Australia as a stock drover and station manager, died at Launceston yesterday in his 97th year. At one time he was in charge of Burrenda Station, Queensland, which carried 280,000 sheep and 6,000 cattle. He made many trips with mobs of cattle from the Gulf of Carpentaria to Melbourne and Adelaide, taking up to 8.5 months for each trip. It was claimed that he was so well known that telegrams addressed TPA Australia would be delivered to him wherever he was living. Mr. Archer was the oldest living old boy of the Launceston Grammar School, which he joined in 1860. Mr. Archer was born at Evandale, Tasmania, and he married Laura O'Ferrall, former writer of Australian stories and poems. The fourth O'Ferrall child was Eleanor Mary Georgina O'Ferrall. She was born in 1868 in Victoria. She married Stanley John Joy in 1887. They had a daughter in that year, however she was stillborn. Eleanor died on the 9th of April 1899, aged only 31, and her husband placed a death notice in the paper at Vincent Terrace, George Street, East Melbourne, Eleanor Mary, beloved wife of Stanley J. Joy. The fifth child, Anna Mary O'Ferrall, was born in 1870 and she died on the 6th of March 1949 at the age of 79. And there is mention that in the family there were three writers, and a Nanny O'Ferrall was mentioned. And it says that Mrs. Archer's younger sister, Nanny O'Ferrall, otherwise known as the Bohemian, also essays the short story with success, her work appearing in the Australia, Asian and other weeklies. Her obituary states Miss Mary O'Ferrall. Miss Mary O'Ferrall, who died at Brighton on Sunday, was well known to a past generation of literary people in Melbourne, and herself the last survivor of a literary family. Her grandfather, Don Brophy, worked on the first newspaper in Melbourne. She was the sister of Laura Palmer Archer, who at one time was connected to the Argus and wrote a good deal for the Argus and Australia Asian. The sixth child, Marie Alicia O'Ferrall, was born in 1878 and she died at Middle Brighton in 1945 at the age of 67. And her death notice states, at a private hospital at Brighton, Marie Alicia, fifth daughter of the late Mary O'Ferrall of Brighton. And the seventh child and the youngest in the family was Ernest Francis O'Ferrall, who went under the name of Kodak, as he was a writer as well, and he was born on the 16th of November 1881 in East Melbourne. He was educated at the Christian Brothers College in St Kilda, and when he was about 15, he began working in a Melbourne bicycle shop. He then began to study wool classing, but the prevailing drought in southeast Australia continued to progress, and he decided that wool classing may be an unprofitable pursuit. He then applied himself to learning shorthand and found a position in an insurance office, and then he was employed as a clerk for the International Harvester Company. Ernest lived as a lodger in a series of boarding houses which formed the basis of many of his future stories. He began writing light verse and humorous stories after office hours and submitting them to literary journals. His first contribution was sent to the Bulletin in 1901 and was accepted, and it was at this point that he used the pseudonym Kodak. After his first success, he continued to submit stories in verse, and they were published in magazines and newspapers. As well as the Bulletin, there was the Gadfly, the Native Companion, Arena and Steel Rudd's magazine. By late 1907, O'Ferrall was offered a position in Sydney on the editorial staff of the Bulletin by the editor, Sir James Edmund. And his Bulletin colleague, Arthur Adams, commented after O'Ferrall's death, "The secret of his humour lay in the fact that he did not look down from a bleak aloofness at his subjects." He describes O'Ferrall as a member of the universal family of suburbanites, and his sole sympathy with all the bodgers of the suburban world made him the subtle interpreter of that inarticulate class. Ernest married Florence Tanton at St Philip's Anglican Church in Sydney on the 15th of December 1909. They lived at Wahroonga and they had one son and two daughters. Amongst his friends, Ernest was known as Pad. He had a serious disposition and was said to be particularly sombre-faced, but from his melancholy he fished up a subtle humour with a sly smile. He liked 3-inch high linen collars, and this led to him being referred to as the religious editor amongst the Bulletin staff. In about April 1913, Hugh Ward, the managing director of the J.C. Williamson Theatrical Company, suggested to John Daly, one of O'Ferrall's colleagues at the Bulletin, that he should write a theatrical review similar to the productions in Europe and America, but with an Australian scenario with local characters and settings. Daly asked Ernest to collaborate with him, and the two men wrote a review over several months entitled Have You Seen Bodger? The manuscript was handed over to Ward in early August 1913. Shortly afterwards, Ward informed Daly that the J.C. Williamson Company had purchased the performing rights of a London revue called Come Over Here, and they intended to stage it in Sydney. Ward intimated that if the Come Over Here production proved successful, that afterwards they might stage the revue that Daly and Ernest O'Ferrall had written. After Come Over Here opened at Her Majesty's Theatre in Sydney in December 1913, it became apparent to the two writers that the company had inserted sections from their own review into the production, therefore substantially and materially plagiarising their work. And the writers claimed that this greatly enhanced the value of the Come Over Here production and devalued their own written review. Daly and O'Ferrall made application in the Equity Court to seek commission to examine the witnesses regarding the alleged plagiarism. The application was successful and it went to court on the 11th of February 1914. Daly and Ernest O'Ferrall each received compensation of £350 for their work. In September 1913, O'Ferrall made a one-act comedy sketch called The Bishop and the Buns that was included in the Actors' Day Matinee, an annual charity event by the Actors Association of Australia at Her Majesty's Theatre in Sydney. In 1908, the British firm of Blythe and Platt, the manufacturers of Cobra boot polish, opened a factory in Sydney. And in 1909, full-page advertisements for Cobra boot polish began to be published weekly in the Bulletin, each one including a verse written by Ernest. The evolving series of ads featured a character from the Indian subcontinent they named Chundalu of Arkimfu, and his berry of cobras, and his two companions, a koala and a fox terrier. The drawings of some early versions included the initials NL, indicating that Norman Lindsay was an artist at that stage. During the pre-war years of the White Australia policy, the depiction of racial stereotypes was a routine comedic advice for artists and writers. In 1915, Ernest provided the lyrics in collaboration with Agnes Mary Lang in the composition of a patriotic song called Leaf Brown Soldiers. The sheet music of the song was published, with all the proceeds from the sale to be donated to the Red Cross Fund. In 1919, the literary critic Bertram Stevens wrote, "Kodak writes of city folk, particularly of those who dwell in boarding houses, of journalists, dejected husbands and irritable suburbanites, some of whom relieve the tedium of existence by drink and perform strange antics for the benefits of the sober." Stevens added that some of Kodak's stories are delicious absurdities suggested by real events. In about September 1920, O'Ferrall left the Bulletin and began to work as a writer and a sub-editor at Smith's Weekly. Regular contributions of verses and articles by Kodak began to be published in Smith's Weekly from November 1920. In October 1922, his play The Bishop and the Buns was performed at the Athenaeum Hall in Melbourne. However, the Melbourne performance received a poor review in the Argus, stated it was acted much too slowly and thus its unreality was emphasised. Ernest O'Ferrall died of tuberculosis on the 22nd of March 1925 at the age of only 43. It said that he died gently and knowing no pain at a private hospital in Pennant Hills. He was described as a man that possessed a genial and remarkably lovable personality. His Bulletin colleague Arthur Adams wrote, "Gathered at his graveside there were only personal friends and relations and brothers of the pen. All had loved this gentle soul and knew he served the community better than any Prime Minister." So it seems that after Hugh O'Ferrall's incarceration, his wife supported him throughout, as his two youngest children, Ernest and Marie, were both born after he was released from jail.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.